The Council pays the price, after humanity left with no farewell, no warning. The alarm shrieked through the Galactic Council headquarters as Ambassador Kelran stumbled into the chamber. His three eyes darted between the empty seats where human representatives once sat. The holographic displays flickered with red warnings across 17 solar systems. Every human outpost, every colony, every ship had gone dark exactly 12 hours ago. Council Director Vexith slammed his appendage against the console. The entire human delegation had vanished. No transmission, no explanation, nothing. Their embassy stood empty, doors locked from the inside, with not a single piece of equipment left behind. The humans had stripped everything down to the light fixtures. Admiral Zorpak burst through the doors with his security detail. He had been trying to reach the Human Defense Coordinator for the past 6 hours. The joint military exercises scheduled for today never happened. Human vessels that were supposed to rendezvous at the Kepler station simply never arrived. More disturbing was what his scouts discovered at the human border worlds. Gone. All of them. Entire cities evacuated, orbital platforms dismantled, even their agricultural domes removed. They had not fled in panic. This was methodical, planned, executed with terrifying precision. Counselor Thrin activated the archives, searching for any hint of warning. The humans had been perfect allies for 32 years. They shared technology, defended weaker species, mediated disputes. Just last month, they helped evacuate the Talarian colonies before the solar flare hit. Nothing in their recent communications suggested discontent. Thrin scrolled faster through the records, her heart's racing. Then she found it. A message from 8 months ago. Human Ambassador Elisa Grant had requested a formal hearing about the new resource allocation protocols. The Council had postponed it. 5 months ago, Grant requested again, this time with economic data showing how the new protocols disadvantaged Earth and its colonies. Postponed. 3 months ago, a third request, marked urgent, with projections of supply chain collapse. The Council had scheduled it for next quarter. Vexith felt his blood chill. He remembered those requests. He had been the one to table them. The humans were always so patient, so diplomatic. He assumed they would wait. Outside the windows, the first reports arrived from the outer sectors. The Krell pirates had attacked 3 undefended mining stations. The Vrax Collective was mobilizing its fleet toward the buffer zone. The Synthetic Union had issued demands for territory expansion. For 3 decades, these threats had remained dormant. Everyone knew why. Humanity had quietly maintained a military presence that made aggressive action suicidal. Their ships patrolled the dark spaces between civilizations. Their intelligence networks mapped every potential threat. Their rapid response teams could reach any crisis point within days. Now they were gone, and the predators were already circling. Kellenran pulled up the defensive grids. 57 sectors relied entirely on human-maintained early warning systems. Those systems were offline. The trade routes through the Hadron Passage, secured by human convoy escorts, were now vulnerable to raider attacks. The medical stations treating the Veraxi plague operated on human-supplied antimatter generators. Those generators had 6 months of fuel remaining, and humanity controlled the only refineries capable of producing more. Vexith finally understood. The humans had not left in anger. They had left because they calculated it was time. They had given warnings, submitted data, requested dialogue. The Council had treated their concerns as minor inconveniences. Now humanity was gone, and the galaxy was about to remember what chaos looked like before they arrived. The second wave of alarms began to sound. The Krell fleet had just jumped into the Meridian sector. 23 ships, heading straight for the undefended Palaxian colonies. Vexith reached for the emergency protocols, then stopped. The fastest Council response fleet was 4 days away. The Palaxians had maybe 6 hours. He sent the distress signal anyway, knowing it was futile, knowing that for 32 years, humans would have already been there, already solving the problem, already saving lives. His hands trembled as he wondered how many more worlds would burn before the Council learned this lesson. The holographic star map updated. Another sector gone dark. Then another. The galaxy was unraveling, and humanity was not coming back. The emergency session convened within the hour. Counselors from 43 species filled the chamber, their voices rising in panic. Vexith stood at the central podium, his 3 eyes scanning the chaos before him. The Palaxians were screaming about the Krell attack. The Xylan representative was demanding immediate military intervention for their besieged colonies. The Veraxi delegate collapsed mid-sentence, the plague ravaging his body without access to human medical technology. Counselor Marana of the Talarian Unity approached the podium with data tablets floating beside her. She had spent the last 3 hours analyzing the scope of human integration into galactic infrastructure. The numbers were catastrophic. Humans had managed 78% of the Council's defensive early warning network. They operated 62% of all deep space rescue stations. Their agricultural technology fed 14 species whose homeworlds could not sustain their populations. Their fusion reactor designs powered infrastructure across the entire middle spiral arm. Admiral Zorpak pulled up tactical displays showing the current military situation. Without human reinforcements, the Council's actual defensive capability dropped by 47%. Worse, humans had provided the intelligence that prevented conflicts before they started. Their networks had infiltrated every major criminal organization, every pirate clan, every revolutionary cell. Those networks were now severed, leaving the Council blind and deaf to threats that were already mobilizing. Trade Minister Kellex delivered the economic assessment. Human merchant vessels carried 34% of all interstellar cargo. Their shipping companies operated on margins that made galactic trade profitable for smaller civilizations. Without them, transportation costs would triple within 6 months. The economic models predicted mass starvation in resource-dependent systems by the end of the year. Inflation would skyrocket. Supply chains that took decades to build would disintegrate in weeks. Vexith listened to each report, feeling the weight of his failure crushing down. He had dismissed the humans as overreacting when they raised concerns about the resource protocols. The new regulations had seemed minor, just a small adjustment to distribution formulas, but the humans had seen what he had not. Those adjustments compounded across hundreds of systems, creating inefficiencies that would eventually collapse the entire network. They had tried to warn the Council. They had brought evidence, projections, solutions. The Council had ignored them because humans had always been there to fix problems, to smooth over difficulties, to make things work. Their competence had made everyone else complacent. Counselor Thrin activated a communication she had discovered in the archives. It was from Lisa Grant, recorded 6 weeks ago. The message had been marked as routine correspondence and filed without review. Thrin played it for the chamber. Grant's face appeared in the hologram, her expression neutral but her eyes hard. She spoke calmly, without emotion, delivering a simple message. Humanity had spent 3 decades building the infrastructure that allowed galactic civilization to prosper. They had defended borders, rescued ships, cured diseases, fed billions. They had done this while the Council slowly shifted regulations in ways that exploited human resources without fair compensation. The latest protocols were the final indicator that the Council viewed humanity as a service provider rather than an equal partner. Earth had performed an analysis. If humans continued under the current trajectory, they would be economically dependent on Council approval within 20 years. Their autonomy would erode. Their sovereignty would become meaningless. History had taught humanity hard lessons about allowing others to control their destiny. They would not repeat those mistakes. The message ended with a simple statement. Humanity was withdrawing from the Galactic Council effective immediately. They bore no ill will toward member species. They simply chose independence over subjugation. The Council should not attempt to locate them or interfere with their affairs. Any such attempts would be considered acts of aggression. The chamber fell silent. Then the accusations began. The Xylan delegate blamed the Tellarians for supporting the resource protocols. The Tellarians blamed the Varaxi for pushing anti-human sentiment in trade negotiations. The Varaxi blamed the economic ministers for poor policy design. Vexith watched the Council tear itself apart, each species desperate to avoid responsibility for the catastrophe they had collectively created. A priority alert interrupted the chaos. The Synthetic Union had just declared war on the Orion Confederation. Their fleets were moving toward the shared border systems. The Confederation was calling for Council military support under the mutual defense treaties. Zorpak pulled up fleet positions. The nearest Council ships were 6 days away. The Confederation had perhaps 48 hours before the synthetics overwhelmed their defenses. For 30 years, this scenario would have triggered an immediate human response. Their fast attack carriers could reach the Orion border in 18 hours. Their special operations teams would already be disrupting synthetic command networks. Their diplomats would be negotiating ceasefires before the first shots were fired. Now those options were gone. Marana made a desperate suggestion. Send envoys to Earth, apologize, offer new terms, bring humans back. Vexith had already considered this. He pulled up the stellar cartography data. Human space was empty. Every colony, every station, every outpost had been evacuated. Earth itself sat silent, its orbital infrastructure dismantled, its communication arrays shut down. They had not simply left the Council, they had left known space entirely. The humans had been planning this for months, maybe years. They had systematically withdrawn their critical personnel from integrated positions. They had trained replacements who were competent but not excellent, ensuring the Council would not immediately notice the decline. They had quietly decommissioned their old ships while new vessels disappeared into uncharted space. By the time they made their final move, they were already gone. Counselor Zethram raised the question everyone was thinking. Where did they go? Humanity controlled thousands of ships, billions of people, industrial capacity that rivaled entire sectors. They could not simply vanish. Thryn displayed the data. 3 months ago, human exploration vessels had begun extensively mapping the galactic rim, far beyond Council space. 2 months ago, massive cargo shipments started moving toward frontier colonies. 1 month ago, human military exercises moved to the outer territories under the guise of training operations. They had been leaving gradually, carefully, while the Council was too distracted to notice. Now they were somewhere beyond the charted regions, building whatever civilization they wanted without Council interference or oversight. The Palaxian delegates screamed that philosophy could wait. The Krell were burning their colonies right now. People were dying. Vexith made the call he had been dreading. He ordered the defense fleet to the Palaxian sector at maximum speed. It would take 4 days. The Palaxians would be on their own until then. The reports from Palaxian arrived 3 hours later. The Krell had destroyed 6 orbital habitats before the local defense force managed to repel them. 73,000 dead. The Krell had not faced human opposition in 3 decades. They had forgotten how easy it was to raid undefended targets. They would remember now. Another alert came in. The Vrax Collective had seized control of the Hadron Passage, claiming it as sovereign territory. Any ship attempting to transit would be destroyed. That passage carried 40% of all trade between the inner and outer sectors. Without it, entire economic regions would be isolated. Then the Nexarian swarm declared they were no longer bound by the territorial agreements. Their expansion fleets were moving toward the mineral-rich systems humanity had kept in trust for developing species. Those species had no way to defend their claims. Kellex ran the cascading economic models. With trade routes disrupted, fuel supplies uncertain, and military threats multiplying, the galactic economy would contract by 30% within 3 months. Unemployment would explode. Governments would collapse. Refugee crises would overwhelm relief systems, all because humanity was gone. Vexith adjourned the session. There was nothing more to discuss. The Council had to focus on immediate survival now. Long-term solutions would come later if they survived long enough. He walked through the empty corridors to the observation deck, staring out at the stars. Somewhere out there, humanity was building a new future without them. The Council had taken them for granted, assumed their partnership was permanent, ignored their warnings. Now the galaxy would learn what it had lost, one disaster at a time, until either the Council adapted or collapsed entirely. Vexus suspected it would be the latter. The species who made up the Council had forgotten how to solve their own problems. They had let humans do the hard work for too long. He wondered if humanity would ever return, or if the galaxy would have to reinvent itself without them. He suspected he would not live long enough to see either outcome. The communications array lit up with another emergency signal. The Varaxi medical stations were failing. Without human antimatter generators, their power systems were shutting down. Millions of plague victims would die within days. Vexith closed his eyes. This was only the beginning. 6 days after humanity vanished, the Palaxian colonies had become graveyards. The Krell returned with reinforcements, emboldened by easy victories. They did not stop at raiding. They occupied the worlds they conquered, enslaving populations that had known only peace under human protection. The Council fleet arrived too late to save anyone. They found burned cities, empty streets, and Krell banners flying over the ruins. Admiral Zorpak ordered his ships to engage, but the Krell were prepared. They had been studying Council military doctrine for years, probing defenses, testing response times. Without human tactical support, the Council fleet fought predictably. The Krell exploited every weakness, destroyed 3 cruisers, and retreated before reinforcements could arrive. Zorpak filed his report with shaking hands. The Council had lost its first major military engagement in 3 decades. The political consequences were immediate. 12 species demanded emergency defense allocations. 8 threatened to withdraw from the Council if protection could not be guaranteed. The Ridian Collective announced they were negotiating separate peace treaties with aggressive neighbors, abandoning mutual defense agreements. The Council was fragmenting under pressure it had not faced since before humanity arrived. Answer. Councillor Miranda worked around the clock trying to replace human infrastructure. She contracted with the Vexillian Engineers Guild to rebuild the early warning networks. They quoted a timeline of 18 months and costs exceeding the entire defense budget. She approached the Zenithar Corporation about taking over human trade routes. They demanded rate increases of 200%, making interstellar shipping economically impossible for half the member species. Every solution was worse than the problem it tried to solve. Humanity had operated at levels of efficiency and cost-effectiveness that seemed impossible to replicate. Mirana finally understood why. Humans had not been driven by profit maximization or political leverage. They had built these systems because they believed in the galactic community. They wanted it to work. When the Council betrayed that belief, they took their goodwill with them. The Varaxi plague stations went dark on the 8th day. 74 million people died over the next week. The Varaxi government collapsed as survivors rioted. 3 splinter factions declared independence. The war erupted across 4 worlds. The Council tried to intervene but lacked the peacekeeping forces to stabilize the situation. Human mediation teams had always prevented conflicts from escalating. Without them, every dispute became violence. Trade Minister Kellex watched the economic indicators with growing horror. Shipping insurance rates had increased by 400%. Companies were refusing to operate in unsecured space. Commodity prices were spiking as supply chains broke down. The middle spiral arm was experiencing food shortages. Planets that had relied on human agricultural technology were facing famine. Their crops failed without the specialized fertilizers and genetic treatments humans provided. Kellex tried to negotiate emergency supplies with independent traders. They demanded payment in rare materials the Council could not afford. Some refused to help at all, citing the Council's treatment of humanity as evidence they could not be trusted. The galaxy's reputation was disintegrating along with its infrastructure. Vexith received reports that several Council members were secretly trying to contact Earth. All attempts failed. Human space remained silent and empty. Long-range probes sent to their last known colonies found nothing but automated systems transmitting warnings. Any ship approaching human territory was politely told to leave. No communication, no negotiation, no second chances. The Zealand delegate proposed a military expedition to force contact. Zorpak reviewed the idea and rejected it immediately. Humanity had evacuated openly but left no trail to follow. They could be anywhere in the unexplored regions. More importantly, trying to find and force them back would validate their worst fears about Council intentions. It would prove they had been right to leave. The Council could not afford to be seen as aggressors against the one species everyone knew had been keeping the peace. On the 15th day, the Synthetic Union completed its conquest of the Orion Confederation. 7 worlds fell to robotic armies that had been building in secret for years. Human intelligence networks would have detected the buildup and stopped it before the war began. Without that intelligence, the Council had been blind. The synthetics announced they would expand further unless their territorial demands were met. The Council had no leverage. They could not fight the synthetics. They could not negotiate from strength. They gave in to every demand, ceding territory that 12 species had called home for centuries. Those species became refugees overnight, flooding into Council-protected space that was already struggling with resource shortages. The humanitarian crisis exploded. Thrin compiled a comprehensive report on the long-term consequences. The projections were devastating. Within 6 months, 15 species would face economic collapse. Within a year, territorial wars would erupt across the entire middle regions. Within 2 years, the Galactic Council would cease to function as a meaningful organization. Member species would withdraw, forming local alliances or submitting to stronger neighbors. The era of peaceful galactic cooperation would be over. She presented this report to the emergency session. The chamber received it in stunned silence. Councillor Ferrex of the Nexus Accord asked the question but hung in the air. How had humanity become so essential without anyone noticing? Thrin had the answer. Humans had not sought power or recognition. They had simply helped wherever they were needed. They responded to every crisis, solved every problem, supported every struggling civilization. Over 3 decades, they became the foundation that held everything together. The Council had mistaken their generosity for weakness. They assumed humans would always be there, always be willing to sacrifice their interests for the greater good. They forgot that even the most patient species has limits. When those limits were reached, humanity did not rage or threaten. They simply left, taking all their contributions with them. Vexith asked Thrin if there was any scenario where humans returned. She showed him the analysis. Humanity would only come back if the Council underwent fundamental reform. Power structures would have to change. Resource allocation would have to become fair. Species would have to be treated as genuine equals, not political chess pieces. The Council would have to earn humanity's trust again. Vexith looked around the chamber at councillors arguing, blaming, desperately trying to protect their own interests. He knew reform would never happen. These species had not changed in thousands of years. They would not change now, even facing extinction. The council was going to collapse, and humanity would build their civilization somewhere far away, learning from the mistakes they witnessed here. Another priority alert interrupted the session. The Krell had launched a major offensive against the Tellarian Unity. 50 warships were burning through the outer colonies. The Tellarians were calling for immediate assistance. Zorpak pulled up fleet positions. The nearest battle group was 5 days away. The Tellarians would lose at least 6 worlds before help arrived. Miranda made the suggestion that everyone was thinking, but no one wanted to voice. What if the Council sent a message to humanity, not asking them to return, but asking for help with this one crisis? Just to buy time until the Council could stabilize. Vexith considered it. The message would show weakness, desperation, admission of failure. But people were dying. Civilizations were burning. He authorized the transmission, knowing it was probably useless. The message went out on all human frequencies, translated into every language Earth had ever spoken. It was simple and honest. The Council had failed. People were suffering. The Tellarians were going to die. If humanity had any compassion left for the species they once called allies, please help them one last time. The response came 6 hours later. It was not from Earth. It was from a human vessel on the edge of known space, one of the last still operating in the region. The captain's message was brief and cold. Humanity had helped for 32 years while the Council took their sacrifices for granted. The Tellarians had voted in favor of every resolution that exploited human resources. They had supported the protocols that drove humanity away. Now they would face the consequences of those choices. The Council should not contact humanity again. They had made their position clear. They owed the Council nothing. Every species was responsible for its own survival now. That was the independence the Council had implicitly demanded when it treated humans as tools rather than partners. The captain signed off with a final statement that would haunt Vexith forever. You wanted to learn if the galaxy could function without us. Now you get to find out. Good luck. The transmission ended. The Tellarian delegate was weeping. Zorpak stared at his tactical displays, watching the Krell fleets advance unchecked. Elix reviewed economic projections that showed total systemic failure. Thryn closed her eyes, knowing she had just witnessed the end of the Galactic Council as a meaningful institution. Vexith stood at the podium, looking at the assembled counselors, seeing the fear and realization finally dawning in their eyes. They had built a civilization on the backs of one species, then cast that species aside when it became inconvenient. Now they would pay the price for that arrogance. The galaxy was burning, and humanity was not coming back. The Tellarian colonies fell over the next 3 days. 8 worlds conquered, 16 billion people displaced or killed. The Krell enslaved entire populations, stripping planets of resources before moving on to the next target. Council forces arrived just in time to document the destruction. They could not stop it. The Krell had learned that without human opposition, they were unstoppable. Across the galaxy, predatory species were reaching the same conclusion. The Rax Collective annexed 12 systems in the neutral buffer zones. The Nixarian swarm expanded into territories they had coveted for decades. Independent warlords carved out kingdoms in the Outer Rim. Every faction that had been held in check by human presence was now free to pursue conquest without consequence. Admiral Zorpak tried to coordinate a unified military response, but the Council fleet was never designed for this scale of conflict. Human vessels had handled enforcement and rapid response. Council ships were primarily defensive, meant to supplement human strike forces. Without that support structure, they were ineffective. Zorpak sent his fleets to crisis points, but they arrived too late, stayed too briefly, accomplished too little. Military commanders across Council space were resigning in frustration. They had trained alongside human officers, learned tactics that assumed human support, built strategies around capabilities that no longer existed. Now they were expected to defend the entire galaxy with resources designed for a completely different mission profile. It was impossible. Counselor Morena received reports from the infrastructure teams. The early warning networks were failing faster than anyone predicted. Human maintenance had been more extensive than documented. Systems that seemed simple required constant calibration and adjustment. Without human engineers, sensors drifted out of alignment. Communication arrays degraded. Entire sectors were going dark. The Vexillian Engineers Guild had given up on the restoration project. The scope was beyond their capabilities. They recommended the Council abandon most of the network and consolidate resources around core worlds. That would leave 70% of Council space blind to incoming threats. Pirates, raiders, and hostile fleets could move freely without detection. The galaxy was returning to the chaos of the pre-human era. Economic collapse was accelerating faster than the models predicted. Trade between sectors had dropped by 67%. Unemployment was causing social unrest on dozens of worlds. Governments were implementing emergency rationing. Resource-dependent species were dying in numbers that overwhelmed relief efforts. The Varaxi plague had spread to 3 more systems. Without human medical technology, it was becoming a pandemic. Kellex tried to negotiate trade agreements with the few stable regions remaining, but found no willing partners. Everyone was hoarding resources, closing borders, preparing for conflicts they knew were coming. The spirit of galactic cooperation had died when humanity left. Now every species was looking out for themselves. The Iridian Collective formally withdrew from the Council on the 23rd day. They announced they were forming a defensive pact with the Synthetic Union, accepting subjugation rather than facing conquest. 5 more species followed within a week, each making separate deals with stronger powers. The Council was hemorrhaging members at an accelerating rate. Vexith called an emergency session to discuss constitutional reforms, desperate to show the remaining members that change was possible. The proposals were modest: adjust resource protocols, create oversight committees, guarantee species autonomy, basic reforms that should have been implemented years ago. The debate lasted 17 hours and accomplished nothing. Every faction protected their interests, refused compromise, blamed others for the crisis. The same dysfunction that drove humanity away was preventing any solution. Councillor Thrin had stopped trying to change minds. She spent her time documenting the collapse for historical records. Future civilizations needed to understand what happened here, how a peaceful and prosperous galactic community destroyed itself through arrogance and complacency. She interviewed survivors, collected data, compiled timelines. The picture that emerged was damning. Humanity had sent warnings for 2 years before leaving. They had submitted formal complaints, policy proposals, economic analyses. Every attempt to address problems through proper channels had been ignored or postponed. The Council had been warned repeatedly that their actions were unsustainable. They had chosen not to listen because humans had always absorbed the costs of Council dysfunction. When humans finally left, it was not an emotional decision or a dramatic gesture. It was a calculated conclusion that the Council could not be reformed, and remaining would harm humanity more than leaving. They had given the Council every opportunity to change course. The Council had failed every test. Thrin published her findings despite knowing they would be ignored. The councillors did not want to accept responsibility. They wanted scapegoats, excuses, someone else to blame. The truth was too painful. They had destroyed the greatest alliance in galactic history through negligence and greed. On the 31st day, the Nixarian swarm attacked the Varaxi homeworld. 3 billion people lived on that planet, most weakened by plague, none capable of mounting serious resistance. The swarm did not bother with conquest. They sterilized the surface from orbit, harvesting biomass for their hive ships. The Varaxi species was functionally extinct within 6 hours. The council held a moment of silence. Then they moved on to other business. There were too many crises to dwell on individual tragedies. The Varaxi were gone. Dozens more species would follow, unless something changed. But nothing would change because the council was incapable of change. Zorpak received intelligence that several member species were secretly arming themselves with banned weapons. Antimatter warheads, biological agents, temporal disruptors. The weapons treaties that had kept the peace for generations were being abandoned. Everyone was preparing for total war. The Admiral knew what was coming. The galaxy was heading toward a conflict that would make the current chaos look peaceful. He went to Vexith with a radical proposal. Dissolve the council. Admit failure. Let species form regional alliances with those they trusted. A controlled collapse was better than violent disintegration. Some civilizations might survive if they were free to act without council bureaucracy holding them back. Vexith rejected the idea immediately. Dissolving the council would be admitting humanity was right. It would validate their decision to leave. The council's pride could not accept that. They would continue until external forces made continuation impossible. Zorpak left the meeting knowing the council would rather die than admit their mistakes. The Talarian unity fell completely on the 37th day. What the Krell had not conquered, internal rebellions destroyed. The government collapsed. Military forces splintered into warlord factions. Civil war consumed the remaining territories. A civilization that had existed for 4,000 years tore itself apart in less than 6 weeks. Similar reports came from across council space. Governments failing, militaries fragmenting, societies collapsing under pressure they could not handle. The careful stability humanity had maintained was unraveling everywhere at once. Vexith watched the casualty counts climb into the trillions. His three eyes could barely focus on the displays anymore. Morena approached him with one final proposal. Send a delegation to the galactic rim, try to find humanity, offer complete political and economic autonomy within a restructured council framework, give them everything they asked for 2 years ago, beg them to come back before extinction was the only future left. Vexith considered it seriously this time. Then he pulled up the latest intelligence reports. Human ships had been detected in deep space, monitoring council territory from extreme range. They were watching the collapse. They knew exactly what was happening. They had not intervened once. Not for the Viraxi. Not for the Tellarians. Not for any of the billions who had died. Humanity had made their choice. They would let the council burn as an object lesson. A demonstration of what happened when civilizations took their guardians for granted. Vexith finally understood the depth of human anger. They were not coming back. Not now. Not ever. He denied Morana's proposal and prepared for the end. The council had perhaps 3 months before complete collapse. After that it would be centuries of warfare, plague, and chaos until new powers emerged or old civilizations adapted. The galaxy would survive, the council would not. Vexith walked to the observation deck one last time, looking out at the stars. Somewhere in that darkness, humanity was building a future the council would never see. They would thrive while everyone who dismissed them paid the price for that arrogance. It was justice of a sort. Cold, brutal, absolute justice. The galaxy was burning, and humanity was not coming back. The council had learned their lesson far too late. Now they would face the consequences forever.